throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I witnessed what they called the brain drain. Whereas a lot of my friends had to leave the North to go to Toronto to go to school and find jobs. And, our best and brightest were gone. And I'm looking around and then I'm watching the Marvel superhero universe expand. And superheroes are everywhere, and they're in mass media. They're on TV. They're on film screens. They're in songs. They're in video games. Everywhere you look, superheroes. But none of them were from small towns, with the exception of Superman, who basically fled Smallville to go to Metropolis to become a superhero, to become famous. So I'm thinking about myself in a small town where all the smart and ambitious young people have left, and I'm thinking, what would happen if there were really superheroes? Would they stick around, or would they have all had to leave too? Would, Captain Caperel have to go to Toronto to become famous? I contacted Andy and I'm like, let's do this anthology. I'm thinking about doing something about Northern Ontario superheroes, and we kind of kicked some ideas around. And then we approached Heather at Latitude 46 Publishing. And she's like, why are you guys thinking so small? Why not all of Canada? There's small towns across the country, coast to coast to coast. And they're all going through the same thing. It doesn't matter where you live, if it's in PEI or BC or Nunavut, people are leaving to find jobs elsewhere. So let's open it up and do superheroes across the country, small town superheroes, and see what happens.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 469 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Matthew Del Papa and Andy Taylor, the editors of Super Canucks, an anthology of small-town Canadian superheroes. We talk about the writing life of these two fellow writers from the Sudbury area, where I hail from initially. We talk about the origin, the superhero origin story of the Super Canucks anthology, the process of putting it together, conceptualizing it, pitching it to a publisher, interacting with the publisher, as well as the submissions process. It is a fascinating look behind the scenes of how an anthology comes together. And soft spot of mine, Matt and Andy are friends of mine from Sudbury, Ontario, so it was just a great excuse to chat with them. But this is filled with all kinds of insights and information, and you're going to love it. And that's coming up later in this episode. But first, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by my affiliate link to Manuscript Report. ManuscriptReport.com is a site that offers you some tools and resources to help you with marketing your book. Writing the book was hard enough. One of the biggest challenges writers have is coming up with marketing strategies and even sales copy, things like that. The way ManuscriptReport.com works is you load your manuscript in PDF format, and then within about half an hour, you get back a detailed 30-odd page report that creates a synopsis for you. I mean, I can't write a synopsis to save my life. It writes sales copy, it writes promotional blurbs, it gives you identification of your target audiences and different pitches for the different audiences of potential readers. It does comparative title analysis, gives you a list of it's like this book in this way, but it's also not like it in that way. So the uniqueness, but also the similarities. It creates narrative crossroads, such as for my Canadian Werewolf in New York novel, one of the comparative crossroads that came out of ManuscriptReport.com was the Dresden Files meets The Hangover, which has been a fantastic pitch that I've been using. And this book is 10 years old this year, and I only ran it in the last year through Manuscript Report. It was like 10 years later, I finally came up with the perfect pitch, thanks to Manuscript Report. Again, it is a great way to give you marketing tools and keywords and so much more. And you can save 10% off using Manuscript Report by using the affiliate code MARK10. That's MARK10, and check it out at my affiliate link at manuscriptreport.com. As mentioned earlier, this is a fantastic interview with Matt and Andy, and it was great to catch up with them. And I am in the process of getting ready for another 10-day trip on the road. I'm going to be leaving later this week, before this episode goes live, which is why I'm recording this bit early. I am heading off to Los Angeles, where I go every April as one of the judges of the Writers of the Future, or Writers and Illustrators of the Future. And that's an annual anthology based on a contest to give beginning writers that boost and that support and that pay-it-forwardness. So what happens is, folks who haven't earned a particular amount of money as writers, not yet considered professional writers because they haven't earned X amount of dollars, are eligible to submit their art, their writing to this contest. As one of the writer judges, we get blind submissions. We read through them throughout the year in the quarterly contests that they have. And then the final finalists, the 12 writers are and 12 illustrators who are the final finalists at the end of the year for each quarter, the top finalists get brought in to spend a week in Hollywood, and they get to hang out with professional writers and professional illustrators who are there. We're there to mentor them, and we're there to engage them in these masterclasses, numerous masterclasses. I'm usually one of the folks who talks to them about the benefit and the power of leveraging their IP in today's marketplace, where you can embrace both traditional publishing as well as so many digital publishing options. And then on the Thursday, there's a huge black tie gala event where the winners are, celebrated, and we get to celebrate each of the winners and introduce them on stage. And then at the end of the evening, the top writer and top artist finalists are awarded their grand prize for Writers of the Future. It's a phenomenal week spent in LA. I'm getting to hang out with some great friends, see some great friends, and before I go, I'm heading down a few days early to see some friends not associated with Writers of the Future, but friends of mine who live in Orange County. Julie, one of my dear friends and co-authors for two of my books, and her husband Joe and their family, and I get to spend a few days with them. It's going to be so much fun. And then I'm doing the Writers of the Future stuff. And then immediately I'm hopping on a plane on Friday, and I'm heading back to Toronto, and that's when I'm going to be attending Toronto Indie Author Con. And I'm going right from the airport with a different bag packed for Toronto Indie Author Con, which is taking place the 18th and the 19th of April in downtown Toronto. I'll have links to Toronto Indie AuthorCon because I think tickets will still be available at the door, though it's very limited. Fantastic conference right here in Toronto. And then finally, I get to return home. But it's going to be an action-packed week, so I'm pre-recording this episode, and I'm pre-recording episode 470, so I can have those scheduled and ready to go, so whilst I'm traveling, I don't need to worry about recording introductions, etc. Or at least that's the plan. We'll see what happens. I know I'm going to have this one done. We'll see what happens with 470 if I'm scrambling to do that from a hotel room in Los Angeles. But other than that, I'm going to skip the regular introductory stuff, such as comments from recent episodes, but I do want to encourage you, if there are things you're reflecting on while you're listening to this episode, please leave a comment over at starkreflections.ca or wherever you listen to podcasts. I love to hear your reflections and what you're thinking about as you're listening to these episodes. And of course, a huge shout out and thank you to those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, as well as my coffee buddies over at buymeacoffee.com/Mark Leslie. Really do appreciate your support. It does help pay for the maintenance of keeping this podcast going, for the distribution fees, etc. Other than that, that is the introduction to this episode. I'm going to roll the bumper, and you're going to get a chance to listen to this conversation that I had with Matthew DePapa and Andy Taylor, the editors of Super Canucks, an anthology of small-town Canadian superheroes. Matt, Andy, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Mark.
I'm so thrilled to have you guys on the podcast talking about this latest anthology that you've co-edited. But before we get to the anthology, I want to get into your backgrounds as writers. Now, something all three of us have in common is the glorious, the super city of Sudbury, Ontario.
Yeah.
But we're also writers from that region. So I'll start in alphabetical order with first names. So we're going to go, Andy, your background in writing and editing as well, and how you got into editing.
Well, this is a new experience for me actually in editing, and I hope to talk about that a bit more. But yeah, I've been writing for like all my life. I think I started taking it, seriously, like by submitting stuff in that probably early 2000s. So, 25 years. I grew up in the Sioux, moved to Toronto for school, lived down there for about 20 years. And then when I moved to Sudbury in 2006, I was looking for a writing community, and I found the Writers Guild and Matt and other people, and been a writer longer here in Sudbury, I guess, than I was in Toronto. So that's how I came to land in Sudbury and be a writer. And thanks to Matt, I'm now an editor. That was a great experience.
Excellent. And what kind of writing do you normally do? Is it normally speculative fiction?
Yeah, I like to write speculative fiction. My brain's always been my mom always said too that I was like one of those kids that just imagine what if all the time, right? Like, and personally, I think it's part to do with the anxiety and everything else that I have. Is just you're always imagining things, right? But I loved all those shows as a kid, like Scooby-Doo was one of my favorites and stuff back in the stuff, and just always imagining the what if, right? Like the not the conspiracy theories necessarily, but just the, hey, what if it was actually aliens that caused this, or whatever. So my brain tends to go to the speculative answer when I'm thinking of stuff. And I enjoy not speculative stuff, but my brain still wants to find the speculative answer when I'm reading a story going, well, what if it's time travel? So yeah, I like to write speculative. I write a little bit of everything, urban fantasy, contemporary stuff, just weird stuff is how I describe it usually. But yeah, often with a speculative element.
Awesome. Cool. And Matt, I know you're a fiction writer, nonfiction writer. Is this your first stint editing, or you've edited before, haven't you?
I've self-published some stuff that I edited, Mark, a couple of anthologies. Creepy Capril, if you remember back in the day, you were nice enough to write the foreword for that for me.
Remember
Back
that
in
one?
2015, I think it was, something like that, 2014.
Wow.
It's been a while. So, so I've done a few. I had a little bit of a background in it. I'm not a pro by any means, but I had a little grounding, enough that I was confident going in that we could, Andy and I would be able to figure it out together. And I think we did a pretty good job. The book turned out better than I expected, which is always nice. So, yeah. And as to my writing, as you said, I read a little bit of everything. I tend to be a little more sarcastic. I focus on fantasy more than science fiction, just because I lack the science background to make the science fiction really, and I hate doing research.
You and me both, my friend.
That's what hand waving's for, Matt.
Exactly. Yeah.
Back it up.
I'm a lazy man, Mark. So fantasy, you can just make up anything you want as long as it's internally consistent. It's not so bad. But sci-fi, like when you start talking about faster than light travel and some of the other things, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So
I don't want to have to do math. Yeah.
Math. Oh my God. I tell people I'm functionally innumerate because math is just so hard for me. But,
functionally innumerate.
Yeah.
I like that.
I could never be an Andy Weir type writer and do all the science in the background. No.
Oh no. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's get into Super Canucks, an anthology that was just been launched in Sudbury, Ontario. And let's talk about, first, if you want to describe what this anthology is, and then I want to get back into the origin.
Yes, the origin, exactly. That the origin story is part of what makes this book special, Mark. I'll tell you where it started, and that kind of framed how it came about and what we ended up doing.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, I'm from Northern Ontario, small town, name of Capril. It's a out of the way kind of railroad town, and like a lot of small towns in the north, throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I witnessed what they called the brain drain. Whereas a lot of my friends had to leave the north to go to Toronto to go to school and find jobs, and our best and brightest were gone. And I'm looking around, and one of the few that stayed behind. And then I'm watching the Marvel superhero universe expand, and superheroes are everywhere, and they're in mass media. They're on TV. They're on film screens. They're in songs. They're in video games. Everywhere you look, superheroes, superheroes, superheroes. But none of them are from small towns, with the exception of Superman, who basically fled Smallville to go to Metropolis to become a superhero, to become famous. So I'm thinking about myself in a small town where all the smart and ambitious young people have left, and I'm thinking, what would happen if there were really superheroes? Would they stick around, or would they have all had to leave too? Would Captain Caprell have to go to Toronto to become famous? So I played around with that with a story with a friend of mine for an anthology that didn't sell. We wrote about Moose Man and Antler Boy, and they were applying to the Canadian Superhero Council for a grant, and they didn't qualify because they were a northerner living in southern Ontario, so they didn't qualify for the grant money. And basically, it was a spoof of the Ontario Arts Council.
Oh, for sure. No. I could see.
Yeah,
I could
you'd get
feel
that,
that
so.
actually in my
Anyway,
bones.
so well, we've all been through that, applying for a grant and not getting it for whatever reason, or getting it if you're lucky enough, which is, thank God for those that money for a lot of people. But anyway, so I started thinking about superheroes in the North, and then I contacted Andy, and I'm like, let's do this anthology. I'm thinking about doing something about Northern Ontario superheroes, and we kind of kicked some ideas around. And then we approached Heather at Latitude 46 Publishing, and she's like, "Why are you guys thinking so small? Why not all of Canada? There's small towns across the country, coast to coast to coast, and they're all going through the same thing. It doesn't matter where you live, if it's in PEI or BC or Nunavut, people are leaving to find jobs elsewhere. So let's open it up and do superheroes across the country, small town superheroes, and see what happens." And that's what we did. That's when Andy came on board, and Heather, and then I'll let Andy kind of take it from there once we started with the submissions. Andy?
Yeah. So like Matt came to me and he said, "Are you interested in editing this with me?" And of course, my first question to Matt is, "Why did you think of me, and why do you want me on board?" Because I had no real editing experience before this. But he laid out his case, and he's pretty persuasive. I've known Matt for at least 10 years, right, Matt? Through the guild and stuff. And Matt and I work well together. We've co-president of the guild before. And Matt was looking for someone to just, help with the load, and, and insight too, right? Like, wanted a different another perspective on the whole thing. So we put the call out, and one of the reasons we were glad that Latitude and Heather pushed us to go Canada wide was just to get that variety of stories and that, because originally when we were pitching it, we were thinking Northern Ontario, partly because we just know we know that area. Me being from the Sioux and stuff, we just knew Northern Ontario, and we knew a lot of our writer friends were from Northern Ontario. So we just figured that's where our voice would reach normally when we looked for a call out. But when Heather said, "Let's put it out across Canada," we did put the call out, and we put the call everywhere, and it got pretty far. Like, we got, people applying from the States and stuff with Canadian connections. And one of our final authors, Casey Lawrence, she was going to school, I think at the time, doing her PhD in Europe when the call went out, and she wrote a story for us too. So we got it pretty far and wide, and we got over, I think, 70-80 application submissions.
Yeah, it was almost 80. Yeah,
almost 80. So and there was a really good selection of stories. Like, I can let Matt talk about that a bit if he wants, but just the economics of trying to put an anthology together and go, okay, we've got this much, but we want to come up with this much, was quite one of the challenges as an editing. Matt, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just the whittling down process was quite the chore, because there were some great stories, but the problem was there were so much like other great stories, and we couldn't take two of the same. Or we ended up with 6 from Northern Ontario, and as much as we would love to include all of them because they were all great, at a certain point, we're like, this can't be a Northern Ontario anthology. We got to make room for. Right. And there was some, great story from Newfoundland. There was a great story from Alberta. So we're trying to squeeze all that in. And then of course, some of them there was a lot of origin stories. People like those, and there was a surprising amount of pensioners, like retired superheroes. That was fascinating. That must have been 5 or 6. So we ended up taking a couple of those because they were different enough. Than a few, and then there was 1 or 2 that was copyright issues, because the people were writing about Superman or Batman,
Oh no, you can't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, they retired. Superman retired to Canada when he was when he gave up
Oh,
crime fighting. Well, that's that. It fits the theme, but the problem is we don't have the rights to Superman. I'm sorry,
yeah.
and
No, no,
even
no.
if
That would be expensive.
exactly, so that's out of our league. So some of that was interesting, and then like I said, it's just so fascinating how people have different ways of thinking about things. Like we put up the call, small town superheroes, and you think they'd all be the same, but they're so different.
Yeah.
It's truly fascinating. So it was fun to read what was submitted. Like I said, reading through all 80 stories was it was a privilege, and I was thrilled to do it. And many of them, well, as you've done anthologies before, Mark, you read stuff. Sometimes you got to read it 3 or 4 or 5 times before you even make the cut,
Yeah.
because this is close, but it's not quite right here. We had a great old time doing that. It was quite the experience, and I'm glad we did it, and I'm hoping we can do it again in 5 or 6 years when we recover.
Well, that kind of leads to the thought of, okay, so you wanted it small towns and you wanted it to be inclusive of Canada. So I imagine you probably go, oh, they're two really fantastic stories and they're both from similar places in Newfoundland. If we take the second Newfoundland story, that means we can't have that Alberta story or whatever it was. So how many provinces and territories did you end up covering in the book?
We covered a lot. We didn't get a lot from Quebec in that, so we didn't have any inclusion from Quebec. We had kind of a couple of Quebec adjacent submissions, but
Yeah.
none of them made the cut. I think we got BC, Alberta. Was there a Saskatchewan story? I don't think so, Matt.
There was one submission that did. I don't think it made the cut, but yeah.
It was close. Yeah. And it's hard to remember. It's like, oh yeah, did that one make it or not? Right.
There was definitely a good one from Manitoba that didn't make it, from Winnipeg that we had to cut, but
Yeah, there's a
few from Ontario. Yeah, we got some from out east too. So like not every province, obviously. And that was one of my concerns when we went into this, and Heather suggested that we go Canada wide. I was a little concerned it was still going to be overweighted to Northern Ontario, but
Right.
one of the things I came to term with was that, we were only going for, between 9 and 11 stories. So we knew we weren't going to fit everybody in, right? Like
Right,
every
yeah.
province wasn't.
There's more provinces and territories.
Right. So, and then I also came to terms with the fact that we're from Northern Ontario. We're going to talk to the most people about it from Northern Ontario. Probably, a third of the submissions are going to be from Northern Ontario. So like it is going to be a little bit more weighted to that just because of the reach of our voice.
And that's where the publisher is too, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
So we came to terms with it, but we're hopeful that it's got a broad appeal and a broad audience. So,
But what about the other diversity? Because I mean, you mentioned, some were retired superheroes, some were origin stories, some were and because when you're weighing it, you're not just weighing geographically, but you're maybe weighing the themes, the approaches, the style. Some were humorous, some were dark, some were light, right?
yeah. Well, in our call out, Matt specifically wanted to emphasize the fact that we were looking for, whatever anybody wanted to throw us. If they want to throw romance superhero, if they wanted to throw horror, like he really wanted to see everything under the sun and see some unique takes on it, right? So I think we got a really, a variety of tones in the collection. Like there's a lot of humorous ones, but there's also some very serious ones. Like there's the whole mix in that, and some darker ones as well, like not little horror tinged ones as well. Matt, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, we got a nice cross section from across the country in terms of geography, and in terms of ages. The characters range from teenagers. There's a couple of teenage stories to pensioners. There is a lot of satire. One of my favorite ones focuses on the red tape that superheroes would have to deal with, especially in Canada. And so that one was a lot of fun. Another one almost has nothing to do with superheroes at all, but it does have that kind of sense of wonder that superheroes often bring, and
Right.
it just had to feel. So we accepted that one because it was just so well written. Some of the ones we turned down were great stories, but they were either one was too dark. It was titled "Closing Time at the Suicide Capital of Canada," I think.
Oh,
Mm.
geez.
That was
Yeah,
a
it
great
was pretty
story.
dark.
Yeah.
but it was just too dark. It was basically the superpower was he could make people suicidal.
Oh my goodness, that
And
is
But
very,
it,
very dark.
but it
Yeah.
was written as a sort of a noir mystery,
yeah,
though,
what it was
right? So it
excellent. It
kind
was
of
a fun
fit the
story.
piece, but
Yeah, and it almost made a cut. And there was about 10 stories that we were looking at, like, can we fit this in? It's so good. But
Yeah.
at the end, we went with the ones that we thought provided the best kind of selection for readers, and
right.
nothing too extreme. The humor can be a little biting at times, and there's a little bit of social commentary in a couple of them. But yeah,
In a
no, it
few of
was
them.
it was a fun project, and we're hoping people will enjoy it. That's the ultimately we want something that was readable, not
Yeah.
necessarily something that's changing the world. We'll leave
Yeah.
that to the superheroes. Our job is just to entertain a reader. So, and I think we have that.
So let's talk about the approach. So accepting stories for an anthology as opposed to being the writer who is submitting stories. How what kind of different hats did you have to throw on for that process?
Well, Matt and I had sort of, I don't know if we came to the point where I think we did a little bit of trial and error figuring out how we were going to manage this. So we kind of did a system where we looked at all the stories, kind of ranked them individually. Like him and I went away and said, sort of A, B, and C, like A definitely, B maybe, depends, needs more work than we, not more work than we think, but needs work. And C was no, definitely not, because either didn't quite, it wouldn't fit or wasn't the right tone, whatever, right? There was the
Yeah.
clear kind of missed the mark type things. And then we kind of compared notes, and then we kind of like advocated, like, the ones where we both said there are A's that we both want them, then that was kind of a no-brainer. But I was higher on some, he saw the potential in some more than
Yeah.
I did. And or we saw this one needs a lot more work, and he's like, no, 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 I think it just needs this much work. So there was that back and forth. And then it was a job of selling it to our editor. Because when we started this process, we weren't sure. She'd given us some indication of how many stories she wanted to take, but she wanted to see what we got first and then see us whittle it down before she kind of reviewed it. And so there was some back and forth there on the economics of like how big of a collection can you put out and how many can you include. So when we finally settled on a number there, we then we had to really do the hard work and start really, Matt and I, advocating for which stories we wanted and selling them to the publisher too, because ultimately it was them marketing and producing the book. So they wanted to be able to feel like, it represent, like they could put their name on it and everything. So, they had some input there too in terms of like, did it meet the vision of what we thought the book was going to be? So they had a little bit of influence on what stories Matt and I ultimately accepted. And then the other part of the editing side of things was once we accepted them, then Matt and I had to go to work on editing them. And with two editors, we talked about a couple of different ways of approaching it. And what we did in the end is we both ended up making notes on the story like you would. And then, and we talked about it a lot while we were going to, but what we liked about the stories, because we already had that discussion when we were selecting them. But so we wrote up our notes and then we kind of compared notes to see where we aligned and where one of us saw, something else that could be improved on. And then we divided up the stories. We said, you take these 5 authors and work with them, and I'll work with the other ones. And we'll work with them. We'll use both our sets of notes, but we'll work with them and come up with the best.
Yeah, as Andy said, the key I think was realizing that we couldn't have 2 editors on every story because it's just confusing to the author. So we each took a lead on a number of the stories, and the other one backed off and just like, this is what we think. Here's my notes on story A. You deal with the author and the editing process and the revisions and everything else, and then deliver it to me for the publisher when we're done. And that's how it worked. And I handled a few, Andy handled a few, and by the time we were done, with our different ideas and everything, we ended up having a fairly solid take on every story, which worked out really nicely. Once we were done with that, we sent it to the publisher. Of course, she had a couple of thoughts of her own. So once the line editor and of course all the other stuff goes, the content editor and everything else gets done with it, and then they sent it back to us. And I wrote up the forward for it to kind of a little introduction on what the book was all about. And basically, after 3 years of work, as you know, the publishing industry, it's like a glacier. It moves very, very slow.
Yeah.
But we got there, and the book came to print about a month ago, and we had our launch on the 21st of March. and so people have been giving us some feedback on it so far, and things seem positive, which is nice.
Awesome. I have to imagine, so Andy had mentioned earlier that, you rank them like A, B, or C, right? Definite, maybe, no, definite, like definite yes, definite maybe, definite no. And then I can imagine, because I've done this before, I've been through this process both with a group of editors as well as individually, is you go, okay, we have way too many A's. How, I mean, because that's heartbreaking, right? You're like, oh, we both love this story. It's amazing, but we have similar stories either from this region or whatever. I imagine you had to make those decisions too, right? Where you both really loved it and like, oh, we just can't make, because again, you have a budget. You have a limited budget of how much money the publisher is willing to spend on the number of words and all those things, and you can't go over it. So how did you how did you get to resolving those? Because I'm sure it happened, right?
I think I blocked that part of the experience out in the sense that I know it was hard, but I'm like, I'm trying to remember the actual discussion about, excuse me, I think some of it came down to, not a cage match, but it was like, yeah, we like these stories, but like let's pin them against each other. What's working better in one versus the other? And then like, like if they were similar type stories, like say they were like origin stories or something, we'd be like, okay, what does this one bring to it versus the other one? And like, if we take this one and not this one, is it, like why, what are we rejecting it based on, I guess, right? Like why isn't it making the cut, right? And it was never, I can't think of a story at that point that was ever a case of it wasn't well written, right? It was never that at that stage or that it needed too much work. At that stage, most of those ones were fairly close to being polished. They just needed a few things brought out. And ironically enough, even though we were trying to make this collection about Canadian stories and stuff, sometimes we had to work with the authors to say, yeah, we know this is set in Abbotsford or whatever, but you really need to like emphasize that. Like, don't be afraid to mention cross streets in the town, right? Not everybody's going to recognize it. But the people that will recognize it, right? So don't be
Yeah.
afraid to like. We want to tell Canadian stories, so don't be afraid to like throw little things that people familiar with the area would recognize. So we had to pump up some of that and some of the stories just because I know myself as a writer, when you're writing stuff and you're submitting to markets, especially in the States and that, you kind of try to make it sort of North America non-specific. Could
Yeah.
be set in any town type thing, right? The Canadianisms always slip in,
Could be
but
Smallville, for example, which could be any
exactly.
small town
So,
in
we had to encourage a few writers not to Smallville their stories and like to sell them as Canadian stories.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's the interesting thing Andy said about that point is after the publication was done, one of the authors emailed me to say, I so enjoyed not having to remove the extraneous U's from all my sentences because the color and all the other Canadian. So she said it was such a nice change to submit to something Canadian that you don't
yeah.
have to think twice on what you write and how you spell stuff, and even references to pop culture that you would like you would, instead of saying much music, you would okay, cut that out, put in MTV.
Yeah, yeah.
What's music?
It's
What's
not a
music?
bag of milk, it's a carton.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you mean bag milk? That's insane. So, but yeah, and then like I said, and it was a fairly congenial process. I don't think there was any stories that were like we got to put this in, Andy. And if you don't put this story in, that's
oh,
over. I'm not even gonna like we were amicable. At the end, there was about three or four that the publisher came in and said, listen, we need to whittle this down. What are the three that would be the least of the highest ranked stories? Which three are you willing to get rid of? And after we hemmed and hawed and said we don't want to get rid of any of them, and like you said, money talks, and if we wanted to make this a viable product and affordable for anybody to purchase and for the publisher to print and turn a profit on, which she wants to do, and I don't blame her because she's got a ton of other books she wants to get going too. This is going to feed that whole machine. Yeah, so we ended up pulling a couple stories that sadly deserved to be in there, but just we couldn't make room for them. It was a real Sophie's choice kind of moment there at the end, but we got it done, and like I said, I think we got a nice broad selection that people will enjoy, which is the thing I'm going to hang my hat on was that people will read this book and they can walk away and say that they might not like every story, but I guarantee we have something for everyone, which is kind of nice. So
I love that.
oh, I was going to just say that the whole publishing process too took an interesting turn. Matt's comment about us, having to whittle it down and stuff. The interesting thing with that was when we first pitched it, the publisher asked us if we were going to write stories. And at first we said, well, we can, we're not opposed to that. We like to write stories, but we said, we'd like to leave room for as many stories as possible. And so she said, yeah, fine. I understand that. And that's like a lot of what Matt was saying, right? We're trying to fit as many in as we could. And then closer to when we were finalizing it, I think Matt and I were fairly close to finishing the edits at that point. Somebody in the States came to power, and the whole Canadianism and elbows up became quite the front and center kind of topic. And the
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Like, so then the publisher came back to us and said, you guys still interested in writing stories? Because I think we got room I think I can afford to put 2 more in. So Matt and I didn't put our own stories in there to boot anybody else out. It was kind of came out after the
I was
fact.
added on afterwards. Okay.
It was kind of not added on, but yeah, it was kind of like as we were kind of coming to that, finalizing the size of the book and stuff, the publisher, decided that she was willing to take a risk on Matt and I. And we told her when we wrote our stories too, is like, feel free to reject them, right? Like if they're not what you were expecting or not. So, they tell you as a writer never to write to market. Well, Matt and I wrote to market, and we kind of wrote some elbows up stories. Matt, didn't you title yours that actually?
Mine is actually called Elbows Up. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
So,
I was wondering about that. So thanks for sharing that. That's cool.
And it was a little bit ironic for me too, because I remember when we were pitching this to the publisher, she was very interested, but she was kind of feeling us out, I guess, in the sense of like, what kind of superhero stories we're going to write. And I remember her asking me specifically, being from the Sioux, she was asking me like, what kind of things would you write about a Sault Ste. Marie hero, right? And I kind of gave her a bunch of things, right? Like I said, I don't really see myself writing like, there's a gangster kind of villain or a joker or whatever. I don't see myself writing those kind of stories, but something that people that are in the Sioux can relate to, something that that they can associate with in that. And so we were describing that kind of process to her in that. So it was kind of ironic that I had to not sell that point, but then it came back around where she's asking us if we can write elbows up stories, and I'm like, oh yeah, I got one. I grew up in this, I grew up in the Sioux, and they're facing layoffs at the plant, and my superhero is going to be a steel worker and everything else. So so I enjoyed writing that story, and it was very personal to me in that. Yeah, there is a supervillain in the story, but and Matt encouraged me to work elbows up into my story too. So I got the phrase in there somewhere as an Easter egg. So, but yeah, no, we enjoyed writing those stories, and I feel they're timely. And when we launched the book the other day, I dedicated when I read a bit of my story out, I dedicated it both to my mother, who's like kind of the reason that I write, and she took us to libraries a lot, and we did our launch at the library, so it was personal to me. But more importantly, not to dismiss my mother, but more importantly, I dedicated it to the steelworkers at Algoma Steel, because last weekend was the final weekend. Most of them had there was over 1,000 layoffs, or 1,000 people that were affected by tariffs and by the change in technology of the plant. So like, to me, it's like, yeah, that's what, my story doesn't center around that, but that's very much at the heart of it. And just growing up in the Sioux is very much at the heart of it.
Right. I'm curious to also ask, what were some of the surprises, things you did not expect in the entire process of putting this book together?
Matt, you want to talk for a minute?
Well, there was a few things that I wasn't expecting. One, having mostly self-published myself, but and previously, I turn a book out in less than a year. I put the call out. I get I have like 6 months for the submissions. I edit the thing in a couple of months. I print it in a couple of weeks, and when it's out. Dealing with a traditional publisher, it's slow. We pitched it in the summer of 2023, and it came out in the spring of 2026. And every step of the way, it was one step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. The submissions are in. Well, wait a minute, we got to open the submissions again, because there was a couple people were late, but they have some stuff, and sending it off to us to edit, and then revisions take forever because people are busy. Most of the authors have full-time jobs. It's not like they can just drop everything and okay, I'm done, in a day. Like it's weeks or sometimes months to get things, from point A to point Z. It just takes that long. So that was surprising. The number of people who don't understand superheroes, who think it's just comic books, like, oh, it's Superman, it's Batman, and they have you never seen? And like I could point out about 50 different movies that aren't traditional superheroes. Mystery Men with Ben Stiller in them. That was a groundbreaking movie. What was another one? Sky High, the Disney one. I just rewatched that last night because I hadn't seen it in a while. With Kurt Russell and Kelly Preston in them. Kind of takes a little more satirical look at it. There's there's a lot to superheroes beyond what's on the printed page. There's books. Most people don't realize that there are novels and short stories about superheroes. Like I said, it's the Sunday morning funnies. People think of the old newspaper bits, with Dick Tracy and some of those other. What was the space guy there? What used to go to Barstool or whatever? What's that?
Flash Gordon?
Flash Gordon.
Oh, see, I was thinking of Spaceman Spiff from Calvin and Hobbes. That's who I was thinking of.
There's another one, exactly. Yeah, that's another comic book that people don't realize that, but that kind of stuff can be done in literature. I mentioned to Andy when I was doing this, the inspiration for a lot of this came from a book edited by I'm going to draw a blank on the name.
George R. R. Martin?
No, although I did read those books too. The what were they called? They're the Wildcard series. That's a long running series about superheroes. But there's one called Temps, was out of Great Britain. Was basically all the really good heroes had gone off, and these were the kind of like the also ran heroes. And I like that angle. So there was that, and then Brandon Sanderson has a series called The Reckoners, which is a great series about the superheroes or the villains, and the average people are trying to keep them out of power, and which leads to the TV series The Boys, which is based on a comic book, but it's a similar kind of type of theme. So there's so much out there, and then that's not even touching the video games. I mean, there's hundreds of video games out there, and ranging from the straight up Marvel like fight 'em, like kind of the Mortal Kombat, where they just swap in superheroes, to the Lego, which does some fun stuff with the superheroes. The Lego Marvel stuff is hilarious and lots of fun.
Yeah,
there's just so much out there. But yeah, I didn't realize that people would always say, "Oh, it's like the comic book." Like, no, not like the comic book. I mean, there is some of that in there, but there's a lot more depth to it. And I'm hoping people will realize that when they read Super Canucks, that there can be silliness, but there can be seriousness as well.
Yeah, for me, like in addition to the stuff Matt said about publishing, like just it taking longer than we anticipated and how much, level of effort was in it. For me, I think it was just being new to the editing process, and I had a fairly good comfort level having, critiqued a lot of stuff over the last 20, 25 years. I've been involved in a lot of critique groups and stuff, so I kind of knew what I was getting into, but I don't think it was until I was like in that editor role my perspective shifted a little bit on it, because there was one, and I don't remember which story it was specifically, but there was one story when Matt and I were writing up the comments and we were deciding on who was going to take the lead with which author. I said, Matt, you take that one, because Matt had very strong opinions about the story. Like, he was really championing it, and he had some really good insight into it. And I said, Matt, you take that one, because I don't know what I have to comment on that story. I got very little. You seem to have a good handle on that. And then as I was writing up my notes to give Matt, I think I ended up writing like 8 pages of notes, just like good stuff. But like I suddenly connected with the story and suddenly had some ideas on, how the author could lean into what he already had on the page, or she had on the page, and just kind of like punch it up a bit. So I think for me personally, like what the process taught me or helped me realize is that there was a bit of a shift in perspective as an editor versus just someone critiquing it. Like, I suddenly took a step back, because I think as a critiquer, it's like, peer to peer, you're critiquing each other's stuff, so you're kind of looking at it from a writerly perspective. And I was looking at it from an editor, but I also was like, I guess, more protective of the story. Like, there was less ego involved, I guess, just more removed and more, I want to see the best that come for the story, which is usually what I come at it with critique. But I just felt like a different kind of ownership and responsibility when we were editing. So I feel like Matt and I, it's the author's story, obviously, but I feel like we did everything possible to encourage that author to make it even shine, polish it even more to make it shine for the anthology, right? So we hope we took that care and guardianship of it in terms of like we hope we help them navigate the story to the place that it is now, and I hope they're all happy with it. So
So, as we get close to wrapping up here, could you guys share some insights that would be beneficial for writers? So, as editors who've worked through this whole process and the project and everything, tips you would love to share, things that you would like, hey, this can help you, dear writer, when you go to submit to an anthology like this or other projects like that.
If I could go first there, Andy, real quick, I'll use myself as an example. Um, I came up with the anthology. I pitched it to Andy. I pitched it to the publisher. When it came time to write my story, I forgot what the theme was about. I wrote something completely different. My story doesn't
sorry,
have
laughing
anything to
at
do
you
with
there,
small
Matt.
town Canadian superheroes. My story is about a TV series where it's basically the American Idol, but it's about heroes, and it's the Canadian version. So, but I mean, I don't make reference other than the fact that one of my characters is from North Bay. I don't really address the small town Canadian angle at all, which is ridiculous. So, my advice to writers when you're pitching to any kind of anthology is read the criteria and pay attention and make sure before you submit, unlike myself, that it actually fits the criteria that they asked for. Because yeah, that's a rookie mistake. I mean, I can remember learning that in university. It was, know your audience, know your, and I didn't. I for some reason I got it in my brain. I wanted to write this story about the, greatest Canadian hero TV series and how it all went horribly wrong. And I wrote that and then I sent it off. I'm like, that's a pretty good story. And then the next day I'm like, wait a minute, that's not what I was supposed to write. Like, what are you doing? So yeah, anyway, so that would be my one advice is, just pay attention to things like that and believe in yourself because no matter what you write, I guarantee, Mark, you've been at this a long time. Andy and I have both been writing for a long time. There's a lot of younger people just starting out, but we all feel the same thing. We all feel like frauds. Like, why are we writing this? Who's going to read this? What do we have that is worth people taking the time to read? Like, I don't have any special insight into anything. I'm not an expert. I'm not a genius. I'm just some schmuck with a keyboard. So, but that doesn't mean that you're not any good. And you're not going to get good if you don't believe in yourself and try. So send stuff out, even if it's not like mine, even if it doesn't really fit the anthology call out. This is actually like the fourth time I've done that. And two of them have landed because the publisher's like, you know what? This is what we were looking for, but we like it anyways. And so you can get lucky and just believe in yourself. So, Andy?
Yeah, I was going to say, a couple things. Like one of the goals I had for the anthology is just I wanted to see people tell stories that were personal and that represented who they were and where they're from, right? So like, and that's what I wanted to showcase. So like, I think as a writer, bring yourself to the story. Don't be afraid to put yourself in the story. Like, well, not yourself directly, but you know what I mean. Like, don't be afraid to let your heart show on the page, right? Like, put what you believe in the story, make it heartfelt, sell it. Don't be afraid to tell stories about your hometown. Don't be afraid to tell stories about what's important to you. And write what you want to write and tell the stories you want to tell, and hopefully they'll find the market eventually. And I think that's the hardest thing I've had to learn as a thing is that you can have a well-written story and it can be rejected like 20, 30 times, like talking short stories. And it doesn't mean it's a bad story. It just means it wasn't a good fit with where it was or what it was up against at the time. And in the case of our anthology too, we had some very good stories that we had to reject. And they if that other story that took the place wasn't there, their story would have been there. So like, yeah, so believe in yourself and write the stories you want to write, and hopefully they'll find a place in the world.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So final question is, where can people find the Super Canucks anthology?
It's online. You can buy it online in a couple different places. Amazon's selling it, Indigo's selling it. locally or online. You can also get it from the publisher. Latitude 46 has it on their website. You can order it directly from them. I think they had a Matt can jump in here after, but I think they had a discount code for a little while there too. Maybe we can put it in the notes later or something. But and in person locally, I know that we have some copies at our local comic book store, Comics North. We have it at Books and Beans. I think Indigo has a couple copies here locally too. Other than that, I'm not sure right now where it is. Oh, sorry, I do know where it is because I'm a big fan of Bacca Phoenix Books in Toronto.
The
And I
back
asked
in
them
Toronto has it too. Cool.
Yes, I asked them a while ago to carry it. I don't know if it's in the store yet, but I know they pre-ordered and stuff. So I'm assuming I haven't been there. I'd love to be there, see it on the shelf. So if anybody's got pictures of it in the wild, please share them with Matt and I. We'd love to see them. So yeah, so we're trying to get as many places that'll carry it and stuff. But yeah, it's out there.
And I'm assuming that if people want to get it from their local bookstore, all they have to do is go to the bookstore and say, "Hey, can you bring in Super Canucks? Because I would like to support this small town Canadian bookstore."
Right. And also, if you don't have a local bookstore, which Sudbury has very few of them now, but if you don't have a local bookstore, go to your local library and ask them if they would carry it because, it helps us get it out there. It helps visibility wise. It does help with sales. So
Awesome. Any final words of advice before we close?
no, thanks for having us. Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything. We're just happy to, share the book with the world. As a writer, I write stories that I want other people to connect with. So that's my ultimate goal with this book is hopefully to have people connect with it and like Matt said, be entertained by it.
Yeah, I would second what Andy said and just tell people that it turned out beautiful. You can see it over Andy's shoulder there on the bookshelf. The physical copy is gorgeous. It's nice and bright. It's well made. The stories are entertaining. I think there's, as I said earlier, there's something for everybody, and I'm hoping people will enjoy it. And if they don't, write to me, and we'll try and improve it for when we do the sequel.
Awesome. And it was put together by a phenomenal publisher from mid-northern Ontario, from two very talented editors and writers, and of course, a gamut of writers from across the spectrum, some amazing talents. So be sure to check out Super Canucks. Andy, Matt, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. It's been nice.
So one of the reflections I want to think about is just how I'm always fascinated, and I think this is really important, to attend to how different editors compile submissions and how they do it based on theme, geography. And I'm hoping, I was reflecting on how Andy and Matt worked on this, how it came together, and how they had to divide up the work and, of course, select those submissions. And again, it's based on the genre and theme and the geography. It's based on other factors as well. Like, they talked about the age of the heroes. They wanted some teenage ones and retirees and tried to cover the gamut across the spectrum of superheroes in different styles. And I have to share this, and this is an important reflection on where I screwed up. So I saw the call for submissions, and I was inspired to write something because I saw, ooh, Canadian superhero, great. And so I jumped right into writing a story. I did not get accepted, by the way. Spoiler alert, but of course I'm not in this anthology. But here's the thing, is I set my story in Sudbury, Ontario. And I wanted to do an anti-hero story, so somebody who believes they're a hero, but they're really not a hero because of a misconception they have. And I wanted to base it based on a major event that was happening in Sudbury, or about to happen in Sudbury around the time of me writing the story, and just prior to the anthology coming out. And that was the dismantling of the Sudbury Superstack. Now, the Sudbury Superstack is this massive structure in Sudbury, Ontario, that was built on the smelters in Coppercliff, just outside of the city of Sudbury. And it was a thing that allowed the as they were smelting the extracting the nickel from what was taken from the mines, and it basically allowed the pollution to be diffused a little bit higher up into the atmosphere, and it's been an icon of the Sudbury landscape. Like, as we were always driving into Sudbury from Levack, 45-minute drive northwest of Sudbury on Highway 144. You could kind of see, just as you got, actually the first time you could actually see the Superstack, unless you were really, really up like on one of the big hills up in Sudbury, like the ski hill or something like that, is you could see the Superstack on the highway as you were coming around by High Falls on Highway 144. And then you would kind of track it as you were getting closer, kind of like the way, you know, when you used to drive into Toronto before all the big buildings kind of hit it. You used to be able to track the CN Tower, especially if you're coming in from the north or the west, which was often how I approached Toronto. But anyways, so I did that because I was thinking, okay, cool. These guys are from Sudbury, and the publisher's from Sudbury, and I jumped on this story because I thought the idea would be cool because the Superstack was an icon, and my hero is somebody who's trying to prevent the bad guys, so he thinks, from dismantling it. So he's in there, you know, fighting, trying to take out the people who are trying to take down the Superstack. So anyways, I thought it was a neat idea for a story, and stupidly, I went with the reader cookies, right? So this is the thing Christine Catherine Rush taught me about is, you know, understanding like, okay, this editor really likes ponies, so I'm going to insert a pony, or this editor loves, you know, Rush, so I'm going to make a nod to the band, or whatever it is. So playing upon the editor's reader cookies was something I was going for. But the stupid thing I did is I did not think, these guys are from Sudbury, the publisher's from Sudbury. That was probably, setting a story in Sudbury was probably the hardest way of getting in. I probably had the most competition with other, because, you know, a lot of the people from the Sudbury Writers Guild would probably be submitting stories, and many of them, you know, familiar with that landscape, probably sat there. So that was, you know, strategically a very dumb thing for me to do. Okay. And it's a lesson in considering, you know, the low, you know, again, Chris Rush and Dean Wesley Smith taught me about, you know, the low-hanging fruit when you see an anthology, when you see a call, is going for that very first thing that comes to you. And I went for the low-hanging fruit. And again, I wanted to play on the local reader cookies, but I just neglected to remember that the other thing too is, I mean, Sudbury, yes, okay, 90,000 people in the city, but it's not really a small town so much as it is a city. And this was an anthology looking for small town stories from across the country. I may have been better off trying to pick some other small community outside of a city, make it really small town, and set it somewhere else in order to help with the diversity. You know, for example, had I, you know, again, the idea I had was the Superstack. So, but had I said, hey, let me set something in a small town in Quebec, you know, potentially just across the river from Ottawa, you know, something like that, that would have fulfilled something I didn't know that they still needed, was stories from Quebec, etc. But anyways, that's just something to consider when you're considering writing for an anthology, is looking at the guidelines. You know, think about the low-hanging fruit, and then think about what are some ways I can probably stand out a little bit more, rather than being mixed in with, oh, we have 5 stories set in Sudbury and we can only potentially take one of them, but also we have 5 stories about this kind of hero. And so maybe my anti-hero story, maybe that would have been a standout thing. But, you know, the setting as well could destroy that, because, again, you're thinking about your competition. The other thing that I wanted to reflect on, and it was kind of like what Matt was thinking about when he first came up with the idea of the anthology, is that concept of the brain drain. And it's been a thing for us here in Canada for a long time. It's a thing, you know, for remote and northern communities, the brain drain, you know, like people growing up and needing to go to a big city, or needing even to go to the States. You know, often it's the joke is, you know, Canadian performers, actors, etc., don't become big until they make it big in the US. You know, you think of folks like, well, the two Ryans, Ryan Reynolds, Ryan Gosling, folks like Jim Carrey, folks like the Mike Myers, you know, William Shatner. You think about actors and actresses, etc., who aren't big until they make it outside of Canada. But the same thing happens from smaller communities to larger ones. Same thing happens in the publishing world. You know, Latitude 46, for example, are the presses that tend to discover the writers. They're the ones who nurture and curate and lift up writers. That's where, Canadian authors like Margaret Atwood first started, were in the smaller Canadian, Indigenous, genuine Canadian presses that were born here in Canada. And then a big international conglomerate comes along with a 6 or 7 figure advance and says, hey, come on over here. And that's what happens, right? So this brain drain happens. It happens in small communities. It happens from Canada to the US, and it also happens in publishing as well. It's just the smaller publishers, they can't compete in terms of the bottomless pockets coming from the international arms of their organization. And then, of course, there's that elbows up aspect that we've been elbows deep in since last year, since a narcissistic predator psychopath got back into the White House. No, I'm not going to pull punches when I refer to the insanity of what's going on there. But that's really, there's always been a struggle here in Canada in the arts communities to identify as Canadian, and to identify Canadian authors, and to identify in Canadian content, or CanCon for short. And I talked about this many episodes back when I talked about CanCon, the Conference of Canadian Speculative Fiction in Ottawa. That was, I think, the very first con I went to was the very first iteration of CanCon when I was living in Ottawa in the 90s. And it's interesting to see how that's never gone away, how CanCon's been an important aspect for us here in the North. And then, of course, with all the tariffs and the idiocy, even though I know that the majority of Americans are awesome, wonderful, beautiful people, this is a time in our relationship where the killer's in the house. He's calling from upstairs, where that's going on, but that elbows up, and the tariffs and the impact that's had. The dramatically horrible impact that it's had, not just on places like Algoma Steel that Matt talked about, but of course it's having an impact on Americans as well as Canadians. But we can't do anything other than to double down on buying Canadian and protecting Canadian. And I really want to encourage you, if you are Canadian, to check out small publishers like Latitude 46, publishing fantastic material, including this amazing anthology. And again, it's a very small operation, I know the heart and the love that goes into it. I'll have a link to an interview I had with Latitude 46 early on, several years back. I did have a great conversation, so I'll find that episode. I'll have a link to it here. And of course, Matt's been in at least one other episode, if not 2 episodes of the podcast going back a few years. I don't think I've had Andy on yet, or have I had Andy on? I can't remember. I have to look for that. I'll have to add links to that. But what about you? What was it that you were reflecting on when you were listening to this conversation? Would love to hear your thoughts and your reflections as we all grow and we all learn together as writers. But that is it for episode 469 of the podcast. I was just recognizing, so Highway 69 was a highway that connects Sudbury to Toronto. I would give it Highway 400 to Highway 69. You take 69 up to, Barrie is where it used to split. You take 69 up to Sudbury, and you take Highway 11 up to North Bay. But interesting, Highway 69 was always a thing. Highway 144 and Highway 69 were 2 of those icons that kind of, in my mind, always led to Sudbury. So how apropos that episode 469 was with Matt and Andy about their Latitude 46 publishing anthology, Super Canucks, and I guess that's very apropos. There we go. Maybe that's just another flub I'll leave in there just for caca and giggles. But that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, putting up with my rambling reflections. Hope you enjoyed the interview with Matt and Andy. Until next week, And until next episode, this is, as always, Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.